This morning, we are pleased to be continuing the very critical discussions that we have been having over the last 2 days. And we will begin our day of thinking, our day of reflecting, our day of deconstructing with a keynote address from His Excellency, Dr. Didacus Jewell, the Director General of the OECS Commission. And his address is entitled, Reimagining the Future Again, Radical Shifts Needed for Caribbean Education Transformation. Dr. Jewell assumed the position of Director General of the OECS Commission in May of 2014. In this capacity, he is responsible for driving the regional integration thrust towards a single economic and social space involving 11 Eastern Caribbean states. He has served as a board director for Latin America and the Caribbean on the Global Partnership for Education and is a current member on the UNESCO board. Dr. Jewell has had extensive regional and international experience, most of it focused on education, social policy, and organizational transformation. He served as Registrar and Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Examinations Council from 2008 to 2014, leading a thorough modernization of the council. He has also served as Vice President, Human Resources, Cable and Wireless of St. Lucia 2005 to 2008, Permanent Secretary of Education and Human Resource Development of St. Lucia 1997 to 2008, as well as Permanent Secretary for Education and Chief Education Officer in Revolutionary Grenada from 1981 to 1983. So we see that Dr. Jewell has a wealth of experience to bring to this conversation. As he takes the podium, we want to draw your attention to his recent publication entitled Education for Uncertainty, Collected Speeches on Transforming Caribbean Education for Global Competitiveness. And please allow me to just give you a synopsis of this book, and I should signal that everyone will get a copy. So it's a fantastic moment to launch the occasion. Education for Uncertainty, Collected Speeches on Transforming Caribbean Education for Global Competitiveness is an insightful compilation of 25 speeches by Dr. Jewell, a leading educator and policy expert. Spanning over 3 decades, these speeches delve into the complexities of the modern world, framed by themes of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and hyperconnectivity. Dr. Jewell explores how these global realities shape the Caribbean's educational landscape and the critical need for transformation to thrive in today's rapidly evolving environment. With a profound commitment to social justice, democracy, and cultural authenticity, Dr. Jewell shares his visionary insights into reimagining education systems to foster resilience, inclusivity, and innovation. From his early experiences during the Grenadian Revolution to his tenure as a prominent educational leader, his speeches reflect an unwavering dedication to the empowering youth to embrace a holistic, forward-thinking approach to education that equips leaders with the skills and mindset necessary to navigate for an uncertain future. So as I invite Dr. Jewell to the podium, he will engage us for 40 minutes, and then we will move to our audience engagement. Thank you, everyone. Let's welcome Dr. Jewell.
Good morning, everyone. I'll skip the protocol and just say friends and educational family. It's really impossible to shape the future without understanding the past. And the fundamental reason why we are here today is because we have not, since independence, come to grips with the role of education in shaping a new society. In every civilization, the development and evolution of education is inseparable from the history of the society in general and the ideological superstructure of the state in particular. In the broad sweep, where's the clicker? In the broad sweep of Caribbean history, education has evolved through distinct historical epochs from slavery to independence, a long, painful struggle for freedom, to the affirmation of identity, to the effort at self-determination. Opposing and retarding this historical trajectory has been the persistence of structures, systems, and ideologies of hegemony in which the DNA of the past, to use a biological metaphor, has mutated to adapt to circumstance, but while retaining its genetic stability. In other words, put in my grandfather's language, the more it changes, the more it remains the same. So the historical context. Placed within this political historical trajectory, we can broadly identify the dominant features of this process, and you can see from the slide here. In the epoch of slavery, with our ancestors literally constituting human capital, and by the way, that's a term I totally resent. I see it used by the World Bank and several multilaterals. 300, 400 years ago, human capital was slavery. We should be talking about knowledge capital. Education was at best religious indoctrination designed to maintain control over the enslaved population and justify and legitimize the institution of slavery, promote obedience and docility, facilitate cultural erasure and assimilation, and provide a moral justification of the colonial order. In the period following emancipation, we begin to see the DNA metamorphose itself, with education playing a complex role, reflecting the social, economic, and political transitions in the region. Its characteristics then reflected the need to preserve the colonial order, instill discipline and obedience through moral and religious instruction, and provide the emancipation with the skills, but the skills needed for the productive efficiency of the colonial economy. As we move through the colonial era with rising anti-colonial temperatures, education became an arena of contestation for greater civic assertion and a pathway for social mobility. This created the momentum for the gradual expansion of education opportunity and the establishment of universal primary education. As the political temperature rose further in the struggle for independence, the hegemony of the Eurocentric DNA was brought into question, and increasingly education was embraced as a key element in nation building and self-determination. In many ways, therefore, the discussion on educational transformation in the Caribbean starts from 1962, the year that first Jamaica and then Trinidad and Tobago gained independence from the United Kingdom, 62 years ago. But it was not until 1972, another 10 years, that a major structural step was taken towards the decolonization of education in the region as a whole, and that was the establishment of the Caribbean Examinations Council. I urge you to read the history of CXC, available on Amazon, to understand how important this was as a step towards the decolonization. Because as we know, education systems are generally driven by exams. And if you change the structure and you take ownership of your assessment process, then you begin to control an important lever in the transformation of education. So technically, the discussion that we now engage started 52 years ago. And here we are again discussing and debating. Any meaningful effort at transformation must start with a frank and deep analysis of our past inability to make this happen. So where have we failed history? Frankly, there are 8 points of failure in the historical responsibility of education transformation. The first, persistent inequality, characterized by socioeconomic disparities, persistent inequality in learning outcomes, an enduring urban-rural divide equating to unequal educational opportunities and outcomes, and sadly, up to now, far from universal early childhood education. Part of the promise of the post-colonial period and independence was the democratization of education, in which education became, for many, the primary mechanism for social emancipation and personal meritocratic advancement. What do we see today? Today, education has become, or is rapidly becoming, the primary instrument of social stratification. Second is the colonial legacy. Despite many efforts at indigenization of curricula, the cleansing of the DNA is still an incomplete process, and the dominance of colonial languages, English, French, and Spanish in education, still marginalizes local languages and dialects, affecting students' engagement and comprehension. The third, quality and relevance of education. Outdated teaching methods are still prevalent, limiting critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving skills. And we fall short, not only in the jobs of tomorrow, but also in preparation for the contemporary social, cultural, and economic challenges of life today in a volatile global, regional, and national environment. There is a yawning chasm between what is taught in schools and the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary for sustainable prosperity. The fourth are resource constraints characterized by underfunding and invisible wastage. Many Caribbean countries struggle with limited financial resources, leading to underfunded schools, inadequate facilities, and insufficient educational materials. Teachers in many of our countries are still buying stuff from their pockets. On the other hand, wastage, let me emphasize this, wastage in many areas of education compounds the challenge. Contrary to our rhetorical sloganeering that many ministries have about no child being left behind, far too many of our children exit the system, to use Sir Ken Robinson's metaphor, as not meeting the production standards and therefore unfit for market. Here is the reality from one OECS member state that will remain unnamed. Between 2008 and 2013, and let me say that I'm not telling tales out of school because this analysis came out of a request from the Prime Minister of that country to do this analysis. So, if we look at it, the cohort reaching Form 5, total, we didn't have the figures of the number of students entering secondary school to track them to Form 5. But those reaching Form 5 total 6,186. Of that number, 5,840 sat CSEC for various reasons. So you know what happens in school. Principal says you're not bright enough to make it, so go sit as a private candidate, don't mess up my results. But only 3,041 of them obtained acceptable grades in 5 or more CSEC subjects, which is generally considered to be the benchmark for decent wage employment. This means that 52.7% of the Form 5 cohort sat the exam, but only 49.6% of that cohort gained acceptable grades in 5 or more subjects. Put simply, 50.4% of fifth formers were left behind, with a per capita spend of $13,580 over the 5-year period, each year of the 5-year period. This failure amounts to a wastage of $42,709,000 EC dollars. And yet we say we don't have enough money in education. This is real wastage, because unless we guarantee that every child reaches the benchmark, all of that money has gone to no avail. This systemic failure points to make a mockery of the arguments for greater investment in education. And those of you, well, we all educators here, we know the battles we fight with ministries of education, with ministries of finance, to get more and more money for education. But that makes a mockery of it and points to the necessity of effecting the reforms that genuinely leaves no child behind. The learning pandemic has hit home in 2024, with media reports citing that the overall percentage of students in the Caribbean passing 5 or more subjects in the 24 exam is about 35%, and that the pass rates for students passing 5 or more subjects, including English and maths, could be as low as 4.9%. Now, caveat, These are media reports. I have not been able to verify that from CXC that this is statistically correct. But the important point here is not so much the accuracy of it, but the fact that this is what the public discourse is on about now, right? And therefore it matters. Relatedly, that these failure points are largely invisible in the system points to our persistent failure to undertake effective monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, utilizing more sophisticated indicators than basic and descriptive statistics with superficial use of outcome-based indicators and inconsistent data collection and analysis of quality outcomes. Teacher training and retention is another major resource constraint. Not only is there inadequate investment in teacher training and professional development, but our models of teacher training need redesign. For years, we have spoken to the idea of teacher professional licensing, but have not had the courage of implementation. While low salaries and challenging working conditions contribute to high turnover rates among educators and our hemorrhaging of talent to North America and the UK. And by the way, when they go to these countries, they get licensed. So the teachers' unions themselves need to get serious about where they stand. You can't be calling for teachers to be better recognized, but refusing, fighting down the professionalization. Fifth is access to higher education. While there has been progress in expanding access to higher education, many students still face financial, social, and academic barriers that prevent them from pursuing tertiary education. Additionally, higher education institutions in the Caribbean often have limited capacity to accommodate all qualified students, leading to competitive admissions and unmet demand. Sixth is the integration of technology. The integration of technology in education is uneven, with significant gaps in access to digital tools and the internet, particularly in rural and underprivileged areas. And critically, we have generally adopted a unilinear approach, focusing on simply the provision of devices. So it's a big political show. We are giving devices to our thousands of our students. It's not just devices, it's internet, digital content, teacher orientation. So the optics of this might appear sexy, but it is the equivalent of gifting your teenager with a car with no fuel account to drive it, with an unqualified driving instructor to guide him or her. You get the metaphor? Seventh area. Policy implementation and continuity have been affected by frequent changes in government and policy direction, leading to inconsistent implementation of educational reforms. It's a waltz. One step forward, two steps back. Long-term strategies are often disrupted by short-term political agendas. Educational policies and reforms are not always guided by robust data and research, leading to inefficiencies and missed opportunities for targeted improvement. And most critically, key constituencies and stakeholders are insufficiently consulted and involved in defining policies and programs. The voices of students and parents, thankfully present, at least students here, are rarely heard, and ministries of education function as command rather than service centers. Ultimately, education transformation cannot be achieved by technocratic conversations. Yes, there is a dire need for research, and not to satisfy mere academic curiosity, as happens in many of our universities, but to provide levers for changing the DNA of the system. Yes, there is a need for curriculum redesign. Yes, there is a need to change our modes of assessment and reinvent our pedagogy. But driving it all must be a compelling vision and consensus on purpose, the why of education. Lastly, eighthly, social issues are still not occupying front and center attention in education. We say it takes a village to raise a child. While generally recognizing the nexus between violence, crime, and unemployability, that reality has not been sufficiently factored into education reform agendas. And let me just say parenthetically, we go through these phases of what is hot and attractive. So now the big thing is TVET. Everybody is let's do TVET because there's a skills gap. Now, it's a fundamental challenge we face now. Are we seeing the levels of crime, the transnational gang injections into the Caribbean? Where are we going with this? The problem is not just a skills problem, it's a mind problem. It's a mindset problem. Anyway. So high levels of violence and crime in some Caribbean societies disrupt educational environments, and they impact students' ability to learn. And school failure is what leads to criminal options. Related, we have failed to build an integrated health and nutrition support system, while issues such as malnutrition, teenage pregnancy, psychosocial and health disparities, I heard you all were told a lot about that by the students themselves, adversely affect students' attention and performance. So, in a seminal article, Travis Jules, not me, and Williams reviewed the history of education reform initiatives in the Caribbean Basin, and they identified 3 generations of reform. The first from 1970s to 80s, second from 89 to 2000, and the third from 2000 to what was then the present, 2015. In essence, their work substantiates the argument that we have not confronted educational transformation as an ecosystemic imperative requiring resolute political will, deep stakeholder engagement, fundamental rethinking and realigning of contemporary issues with future casting. A quick recap of their findings provides empirical specificity to these arguments. The first generation of reforms characterized by expansion of access, significant efforts to expand access, particularly at primary and secondary levels following independence. Second was institutional development, regional education bodies like CXC. Third, curriculum revision, revision of curricula to include more relevant content and reflect local contexts and aspirations. Fourth, educational infrastructure, massive investments post-independence in schools, building schools, etc., to improve enrollment. The second generation of reforms, neoliberal reforms, of course, influenced by our friends in the multilateral agencies who are the fount, in our view, of all wisdom. Introduction of neoliberal policies emphasizing efficiency, accountability, and responsiveness to economic demands. Quality improvement, focus on improving the quality of education through teacher training, curriculum reforms, and assessments that are aligned with international standards. Thirdly, expansion of tertiary, development and expansion of tertiary institutions to meet growing demand and support economic diversification. And lastly, technological integration, initiatives to integrate technology in education, though often unevenly implemented across different countries and regions. Then the third generation that they speak about is global commitments, alignment with global educational frameworks such as the Education for All goals and the Sustainable Development Goals to enhance education quality and access. Continuing teacher professionalization, 21st century skills. So where do we go from here? It starts with asking ourselves, what do we really mean by educational transformation? And the answer to this question is not a technical answer, but a political challenge with deep technical implications that is only attainable by the broadest social coalition. In the long march of human history, an entire constellation of thinkers, from the ancients to the contemporary, have emphasized the why of education. And that word cloud you see there speaks to, I did a deliberate search and created this word cloud of what all the ancients, the notable ancients, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Confucius, Isocrates, etc., all defined the why of education as this cloud illustrates in terms of human virtue and the elevation of the human spirit. They didn't talk about skills, human virtue and the elevation of the human spirit. Now, that might sound abstract and philosophical, but check it carefully. The more contemporary educators, Dewey, Montessori, Vygotsky, Piaget, Freire, Steiner, Hooks, Gardner, Robinson, etc., relatedly defined the Y of education, again as shaping social values and individual virtues. So it is the definition of purpose that has guided the shaping of education systems in every civilization. Yet it is sad that we in the Caribbean have only paid superficial attention to this question. In the post-independence Caribbean, the nearest official definition of the purpose of education in the Caribbean was the Statement of the Ideal Caribbean Person promulgated by CARICOM in 1997. The story around this attempt to define purpose merits a study in its own right, as it was both applauded for the attempt and vilified for its obtuseness. But even then, while we at the Caribbean Examinations Council at the time were seeking to apply this definition of purpose to the educational assessment construct, at a meeting in Montego Bay, CARICOM itself actively sought, driven by the economic imperatives of the CSMA, the Caribbean Common Market and Economy, to reshape that from being a statement of the ideal Caribbean person to being a statement of the ideal Caribbean worker. I will not comment on that. You think about the idiocy of this. I recall this unpleasant memory as a caution of what happens when bureaucratized thinking imposes linear simplifications on lofty ideas. The attempted transposition from an ideal person to an ideal worker is the ultimate subordination of the complex humanity of the person to the mechanistic factor of production of the worker. An error that is so eloquently identified way back as 1902 by W.B. Du Bois, when he warned, and I quote, "The ideals of education is there, whether men are taught to teach or to plow, to weave or to write, must not be allowed to sink into sordid utilitarianism. Education must keep broad ideals before it and never forget it is dealing with souls and not with dollars." So let us start with purpose. What is the Caribbean that we want? Now, as I go through the remaining slides, check the dates, because these are concept slides that I did going back many years. So you'll see the point about us joking with this thing. In this historical epoch, there are three broad imperatives that must be confronted by Caribbean civilization: establishing a regenerative society, building a sustainable economy, and nurturing a participatory democracy. Right? What does that boil down to? Establishing a regenerative society involves addressing food security, healthy lifestyles, creating equitable opportunity, mobilizing safe and caring communities, and maintaining and preserving ecological balance. The slide deck will be made available, so you don't have to force yourself to copy this. Second, building a sustainable economy requires that we utilize green and renewable energy, build climate resilience, create productive jobs, and ensure, again, equitable growth. Nurturing a participatory democracy requires the assertion of citizenship rights, but balanced with the assumption of citizenship responsibility in a context of social and political accountability. If we agree on these three broad ambitions, what then are the knowledge, skills, and competencies and attitudes needed for their realization? And it's all summed up in this slide. The knowledge requirements include scientific and technological, that is basic scientific principles, ICT, etc. Traditional and indigenous knowledge, important. And I heard that the Kalinago representative here spoke eloquently to this issue. The generational wisdom accumulated in every geographic cultural context, knowledge incidentally, which can be invaluable in restoring ecological balance to our planet, which is of key. The historical and civilizational knowledge incorporates the history, the arts, and the literature of one's own space, as well as the patrimony of all humanity. The key skills and competencies include design thinking and engineering, as well as critical thinking. The attitudes that are needed to be universally cultivated are tolerance and respect. Think of teenage gun violence, the fights, the battles in schools. a capacity to and a disposition to self-reflection and the ability to both compete as well as to cooperate. This conceptual work, defining the purpose of education in the Caribbean context, was closely aligned with the influential and pioneering work done on the international front. 28 years ago, the UNESCO published the Dolores Report. And by the way, Michael Manley was part of that think tank leading this, on the International Commission on Education for the 21st Century. And it was unequivocal in the challenge posed by the new century. It said that education must simultaneously provide maps of a complex world in constant turmoil and the compass that will enable people to find their way in it. This is from way back 28 years ago. And what it said there is even more relevant today than it was yesterday. So what did the Dolores Commission, how did they practicalize that? The Commission went on to identify 4 pillars of learning. Learning to know, involving a solid competency in reading, numeracy, and scientific understanding, strong comprehension, and the ability to think critically, research, and analyze. Learning to do, the capacity to apply knowledge and to act, as well as essential skills. Learning to live together, requiring strong communications, conflict resolution, and cultural sensitivity ability, as well as multilingualism. Learning to be, developing self-esteem, emotional intelligence, critical thinking, cultural awareness. Then 9 years later, UNESCO added a 5th pillar, learning to transform oneself and society, representing a synergy of cognitive, practical, personal, and social skills in order to achieve gender sensitivity, sustainable lifestyles, ecological compliance, respect for life and nature, social solidarity, and a commitment to peace and democracy. It is testimony to the quality of that analysis that it is as relevant today as it was yesterday. But what is most important about attempts at transformation is that the sincerity of the intent must be matched by the creativity of its implementation. The ultimate value of such visualization is its realization. Too often we cite lofty ideas for which we have no practical construction blueprint. So transformation must be systemic, integrated, and multidimensional. And this takes me to the sacred principle reinforced by early analysis of the 3 generations of transformation in the Caribbean, that transformation can only be accomplished if our approach is systemic, integrated, and multidimensional. This simple systems map identifies the key elements of the transformation process and their interconnectedness. We could continue adding more and more granular detail, but that would make it appear confusing. To make it as comprehensive a roadmap of the changes that we plan. But I just wanted to illustrate the need to ensure that the articulation of change, the interconnectedness and the multidimensionality of action must be assured. So from a high altitude perspective, considering our historical experiences in the Caribbean, the weaknesses of our earlier attempts at transformation, the lessons to be learned from successful efforts internationally, there are 6 major thematics that must be elaborated in a new agenda of education transformation. 1, policy and governance, because policy sets the political agenda and governance aligns the institutional apparatus to that agenda, as well as ascribes the relations of power within the process. And empowerment is key in education. If we overlook this political dimension, we lose the plot, because the politics of education transformation is fundamentally about the relations of power and the exercise of ideological and conceptual hegemony. From our experience, this is an obvious but ignored contestation between multilateral agencies to set their conception of the agenda as distinct from adopting a co-creational approach to the challenge of education transformation. And at the OECS, we experience that almost every week when some development partner comes with an idea. We have money, we can fund this. Well, you have money, you haven't sat with us and say, what are your priorities? You know. And beyond this is the fact that influence and thought leadership is directly related to the capacity of these agencies to leverage, mobilize, and dispense resources in the fulfillment of their agenda. Suffice to say that the countries whose transformations we hold high as beacons, that they never followed the path prescribed by multilaterals, but shaped their programs in alignment to the vision of the future they wanted. Talking about the Singapores, the Finlands, and all of them. So, community and stakeholder engagement. Educational transformation is not for experts to shape. I just happened to come across this social media post. Why are teachers never considered the experts in education? It's always someone outside the classroom. The universe of stakeholders must be part of this convergence of hands, hearts, and minds. Professional development of teachers, school administrators, counselors, special ed professionals, psychologists, classroom paraprofessionals, school nurses, librarians, media specialists, IT support, technology coordinators, nutritionists, and even cafeteria staff, parent-teacher coordinators and community outreach coordinators, mental health professionals. No need for ministers and PSAs to freak out. We are not talking about creating a duplicate public service within the education sector. But what we're talking about here is optimal utilization of talent in all sectors in a context of national service. And there are many creative ways to achieve this. Too often, we are not committed to doing what is necessary for us, but we readily submit to what is required of us by others. The Teachers Union in our Caribbean consistently lament the status of teachers, but as I said, are lukewarm about the licensing of teachers. Yet when our teachers move to greener teaching pastures, licenses is ultimately a readily accepted must. The recent debate in Jamaica on teacher shortages and the solution provides context. The fourth thing is curriculum development as an opportunity to align learning to learn, learning to do, to be, to live together with the content and application of knowledge in and out of school. Fifth, technology integration. Not simply about the utilization of technology in schools, but importantly, creating and innovating with technology at all levels of the system. Assessment practices. When Alan Hansen advised in 1994 that, and I quote, the individual in contemporary society is not so much described by tests as constructed by them. He has said in a nutshell how important our systems of assessment and CXC in particular are, not just for certification, but for the definition of the new Caribbean person. Other considerations. Intersecting logically as a cross-cutting imperative with professional development, community and stakeholder involvement, curriculum development, technology integration, and assessment is the reinvention of pedagogy. Our response to learning failures is too often a remediation approach rather than a reconstructive endeavor. So there are failures in learning. Let's tweak how we teach. We're tweaking it. We're trying to improve how teachers teach. But we are not fundamentally rethinking the pedagogy. So it's always how you improve classroom delivery, but never about how do we extend learning beyond the classroom. And we saw that today. Yesterday, I was privileged to sit with Dr. What's your name again, Miss? George, Dr. George, in how she popularized mathematics. This is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about a reconstruction of pedagogy. Pedagogy must be engaging, challenge critical thinking, reflection, and action. And above all, it must be fun. That's a word we've lost in education. Fun. We are having children sitting there as mindless zombies being preached to by teachers and not understanding a word of what's happening in the classroom. Pedagogy is supposed to be the energy that fuels the learning process, and it requires creative, committed, and competent professionals working with actors from every sector of society to make learning relevant and to facilitate the application of knowledge in every present and future circumstance. As I said, Dr. Lloyd George's presentation yesterday, Numbers in Everyday Life, is a perfect example of the power of reconstruction in pedagogy. It demonstrated how learning can be achieved through the involvement of parents, the discovery and application of numbers in everyday life. It's everywhere around us. How many lights in this room? How many people in the room? You know, and their relevance and awareness, and consequently children's joy in learning and discovery. You know, parenthetically, how I'm a failure in mathematics, I have to admit. And the reason for that, I blame on my infant school teacher. Mental arithmetic was us standing in a circle with her in the center of the circle, with your hands outstretched and a ruler in her hand. And if you can't answer questions on time, you get wrapped on your hand. We were terrified of the wraps, so we couldn't calculate. Pedagogy and curriculum are inseparable because they fundamentally interconnected in shaping the educational experience. Pedagogy determines how content is delivered, ensuring that teaching methods align with learning goals and adapt to students' diverse needs. It influences curriculum content, integrates assessment practices, and provides continuous feedback for improvement. Together, they ensure that the curriculum is effectively implemented, engaging, and meets its educational objectives, and they are complementary sides of the learning coin. The school, as the center of gravity of the system, is in dire need of a paradigm shift. And 5 years ago, CARICOM focused on this. Extensive work was done on the new Caribbean school concept by a group I had the honor of leading. We sought to redefine the Caribbean school in every conceptual detail, including its architecture. We included a leading Caribbean architect in this process. The new school concept took the journey of Calvary almost 5 years ago. It was approved, noted, adopted at different levels, but no effort at implementation. Until, thank God, Prime Minister Mia Mottley's commitment in July of this year to modernizing schools in Barbados, which she described as that dreary, damp, and gray schools can no longer suffice at a modern school infrastructure design competition. This is an important part in the effort to make school cool. Final metaphors. Let me indulge in a final simplification of the fundamental challenges facing us. In an historical epoch of uncertainty, rising temperatures, of hate and climate, as well as exponential technological disruption, education transformation is an unrecognized priority if we are to salvage human civilization. This speaks for itself. In the last 3 months, the learning pandemic has hit home. 315,000 articles referenced on Google on the topic Caribbean education crisis. In our region, we cannot take the same approaches to transformation that have not achieved significant results, yet expect different outcomes. We excel at navel-gazing technocratic solutions, making grand prescriptive declarations, divorced from the lived experiences of those who are at the receiving end and constantly changing trajectory. It is like building a new electric car that is expected to take us to this new destination, but we've been focusing on the technical perfection of its engineering without clarity of vision on its purpose, with insufficient engagement of its passengers, without visionary anticipation of its load, without consideration of the competencies of its drivers. And this is what Jury said. I have 1 minute, okay. All right, so let me end. I'm going to end by painting a picture of where this is all going in our contemporary Caribbean. This is the picture of our contemporary reality that should haunt and drive us to action when we choose to focus on selective positive elements rather than see the interconnectedness of the full composition. So this is a family. We have an aspiration for a university graduate in every household. You see the bright girl with her graduation cap? But that is one that is undercut if in that same family and household, there is a brother who never moved from primary to secondary school and who has had to learn manual skills on the job, or if ambitious enough to supplement his capabilities through some basic skills training. There's a sister whose secondary education was cut short by teenage pregnancy, as the hotel maid there, exhausted, forced into low-wage employment and unable to discharge the economic responsibilities of that circumstance. So she's a latchkey single parent whose son is an unattended flower planted in infertile circumstances, and most probably destined to produce thorns rather than blooms. And we have another brother, creative, restless, and bored with school, impatient to achieve the better life. Notice that characteristic. This is the one who is creative, restless, bored with school, impatient to achieve the better material life that his lack of achievement can never attain, and finding the sense of power, belonging, and identity in the nefarious worlds of gangs, living fast and dying even faster. And there's another sibling, special needs, who requires the patient care and attention and love that only a tight-knit family and a caring education system can provide if he or she is to achieve any dignified autonomy. The asymmetry of this family is what translates into a society whose collective potential is crippled by too many being left behind and too great an individual responsibility, the girl in the graduation gown, to those able to get ahead. These are the casualties of our education systems and pointers of the incalculable human wastage and an invisible financial wastage in a system where a significant percentage of GDP is spent on education. And it's not like we don't know and understand this, because here's a statement made by a high official from Trinidad and Tobago. Education is not just about getting good results and ensuring students become productive, but ensuring that they become productive citizens, and so on. That is the real picture that education transformation is supposed to recompose. Are we going to stop talking and just do it? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jules. We have approximately, which time is it? 7 minutes for questions. Is that correct? Yeah. So if I can ask our colleagues in the audience to raise their hand and quickly get to the mic, we can take these questions rapid fire, one after the other. I'll ask Dr. Jules to take note of. Good. Dr. Jules is also indicating if afterwards you don't feel that you've had the time to engage, you can send the questions in and he can engage with you via the email. So I see some hands up, so I'd ask Dr. Gordon to get quickly to the mic, please. Thank you. And so we can move. Yes, please. There's another hand in the audience. I didn't see it, unfortunately. There's another hand. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for an excellent presentation. And you know, I was in UNESCO at the time when the Delors Commission was established. So when you said 40 years, I kind of wonder, 40 years ago? Yes, and I won't say anything more, start calculating my age. But your last statement, do it. I need to ask our colleagues here why we can't do it. We arrived as indentured workers or enslaved people across the ocean. The weaklings died in the crossing. So we arrived as a strong people. And we have moved ourselves from the plantation to the nation. But there seems to be some fear of changing. And I'm going to just take one area. In 1998, I think, the La Romaine meeting in Trinidad, we generally agreed that the teaching profession needs to be governed. The SDG 4 again emphasized teaching profession needs to be governed. We had a task force in the Caribbean to help us to establish a council to govern the teaching profession so that the profession would be guided. We are still today in 2000. I came home in 2006 and established Jamaica Teaching Council, set it up, not establish it, set it up in 2009. Today is just going through Parliament. I want to ask us, what's the resistance to change? Belize has a commission, Jamaica has a council, and the teaching profession in the Caribbean is still not governed. In Jamaica, the helpers have gotten together, and there are no home ecologists. They're registered home ecologists. They had the wisdom to know that they must now become a profession, and the profession is to be registered and licensed. What is happening in our countries, why we cannot have a registered and licensed teaching profession having started in 1998. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Dr. Jules.
Fine.
Thank you. I see we have another question. 2 questions on the floor. Good. 3. So if you can get to the mic, please, so we can move quickly, because I know our visual summary is almost ready.
Good morning, His Excellency. Good morning to those present. Tiffany Skerritt from the island of Montserrat. I see several times during your presentation, we've identified politics and politicians as a clear barrier and disruptor to the progress of education. My question to you is, what would the Caribbean look like in the absence of a political structure, or maybe in the presence of a political structure that required qualifications, maybe not qualifications, but qualified and passionate leaders to take hold? So you want to be a member of parliament, more importantly, you want to be a minister of education. How do we shift the requirements so that those in this room are not more passionate, more educated than those who have the political power to decide?
Okay, just quickly to this one. Let's be clear. If you listen carefully to what I was saying, all of us here, politicians, technicians, all of us have equal responsibility for getting this done. So I wasn't trashing politicians. And in fact, we cannot escape the fact that political leadership is an inescapable component of our society. The challenge is, how do we hold them accountable, and how do we ourselves exercise responsibility for the things that we do? Because I can tell you, having worked at many levels in the public service as a permanent secretary, you'll be surprised how a minister with the greatest intent to make change can be totally shafted by a PS who put for their own reasons maybe against the minister, right? Equally, it goes the other way, where public servants believe that they have no accountability and they hide under the shield of their protection as public servants. So it's a broad, we all have a role to play, and we have to exercise leadership and be held accountable for whatever level you find yourself in.
Thank you for that. We have 3 more questions on the floor, and at the end of the last question, we will wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much. I had actually the same reflection as Dr. Gordon. Why is it so difficult to make change while we all, to some extent, are convinced that change is needed? And I think, and this does not only refer to the Caribbean as such, I think it is almost a worldwide phenomenon. And I think that there are 3 reasons why there is little change. It would be good to have your reflection on that. The first one is that we don't feel the crisis as much as, for instance, when COVID-19 arrived. We actually felt that crisis, and people acted, and governments acted in many cases very efficiently. I don't think we actually feel that crisis because, to some extent, the education system, or at least the public schooling system, still functions within our present socioeconomic structures. People go to school, they are not on the street, they do learn something, undoubtedly not enough, and they arrive at the labor market, and okay, the labor market integrates many of them, again, not all of them, and so on. To some extent, it functions, not effectively, but probably efficiently. The second reason, I think, is that, and it's the point you just referred to, that the difficulty with the system is that while everybody is responsible, everybody also can say that it is not my fault. It is not me as such. And I think many of us do not necessarily feel that we are not doing our work. We are doing our work. In many cases, teachers do, parents play their role, principals do, PSs do, and so on and so forth. But it's difficult to be responsible for a result over which you have relatively little control because you're part of a system. And the third reason, I think, is that actually, as you mentioned yourself, there are so many areas in which we have to work at the same time, and the capacity of our systems is relatively weak. That's not the individual competencies. Individual competencies, in many cases, are very strong. But the capacity of the system to, at the same time, address 5, 6, 7 different areas is really a challenge. And I find it difficult because I've been working in this area for many, many years, and I find it difficult to see how to get out of this. So it would be good to have your reflection.
Yeah, okay, quickly, a number of things there. One, you're quite correct. Who feels it knows it. And remember in the address, I was pointing to the fact that stakeholders have to be involved. Now, a ministry of bureaucracies are faceless things. They tend to be faceless. Systems are impenetrable. They just move along on their own momentum. The relations of power is important to the extent that you engage stakeholders and they are given positions of influence, not technical positions, but their voices matter, and matter to the point where they can be held, bureaucrats can be held accountable for the things that they promise to give parents and so on. Then that begins to change that equation. So who feels it knows it. The relations of power is important. On the capacity point, the more you involve, you said earlier, it takes a village to change this thing around. The more actors are involved at their level in making the changes that are necessary, the more capacity there is, right? And I mean, it's incredible when you reach out. There was reference in my biography to the Grenada Revolution. More changes and transformations were done in education in a period of 4.5 years than done in 20 years in the Caribbean. Schools had not been repaired for about 30 years. And what happened was at one point, we simply called on communities, the private sector, to help repair schools. And we tracked every contribution made. 20 million EC dollars donated in material, labor, and so on by communities. What was the outcome of that? Not just that the schools were repaired, but school vandalism stopped because the communities took responsibility for their schools.
Thank you. Next question, and I'll ask if you can make it quickly, please,
Yes,
Dr. Ali.
thank you very much, Dr. Jules. Excellent presentation, as was said. My reflection really has to do with the 3 waves that you referenced in reform and the pointing towards systemic transformation of education across many states in the region, but also at the regional level as we move from old regionalism to new regionalism. My question is, I'm looking at what has been considered and looking at what we have done in the region, particularly in the compartmentalization of education in its various facets and the projectization of education in its various forms, when we are working at the nation state level, or we are working at the regional level, or we're working with development partners, we tend to work in silos and we tend to work from a projectized perspective. And that creates the challenges for systemic transformation as you spoke to. How do we overcome this as a region? Thank you.
That's a difficult one. but I mean, and it's difficult not because there are not answers to it, but because I have to be careful with what I say, right? Because, yeah, I sit as Director General of the OECS, and there are distinct differences in the way we approach these questions and the way it's approached at a wider regional level. But fundamentally, it comes to the issue of the relations of power and how we do things. If we take a bureaucratized approach to things, as in bring ministers, okay, so we want to do education transformation. So usually you have a task force, a group of experts sit, they prepare a really solid plan that could get multiple PhDs for its elocution and everything. And then they bring this to a council of ministers who are asked to note, recognize, approve, blah, blah, blah. It stops there. What we realize at the OEC is that this is not taking us where we need to go. So what, and our ministers, many of our ministers are present, they can tell you what happens now. Every council, prior to our council of ministers, we ask ministers, what is top of mind for you? When we convene the meeting, the council of ministers, it starts with a political caucus of the ministers, discussing among themselves the issues of concern for them. And then out of that, we then go into sessions. The reporting that is done is on work in progress that would have come from exactly that political decision making. So you see what's happening there. So the political direction and driving of the process is assured in that way. Then in terms of the involvement of stakeholders, I remember distinctly the first time we tried that effort it was a meeting in Antigua. The minister decided to invite the presidents and vice presidents of every student council to attend the meeting. And they didn't just attend the formal opening ceremony, they sat as an outer ring of the ministerial. And they sat there listening carefully and intently. And I suggested to them, why don't we ask them if they have anything to say on any agenda item? And the first time they opened the floor, they were reluctant. And after that, they took over the meeting. Everything the ministers said, they had something to say, right? Now that gives them a real sense of involvement in the process, and their views matter and have to be taken into account. A lot of the richness of that process came from there. Now you think the Minister of Education in Antigua, Darrell, can go back to his ministry after a meeting like that and ignore students who want to come to his office because they have further ideas on what needs to be done? That's how we start to transform the process. Enough said.
Thank you. Javier?
Thank you. And I want to congratulate you for the really great presentation, very comprehensive. I want to highlight one of the points that you did, which was expenditure of education and the importance of that expenditure. We know that transforming education requires a lot of resources, and we know that there's a lot of research showing that up to around $8,000 per student PPP, there is an important correlation between quality and expenditure. Nonetheless, Latin America as a whole expends around $2,000 per student per year. And you were showing, according to the figures you just showed, you're spending $1,000 per student per year. One could think that that's a problem of just the stage of development of where we are, maybe we're a poorer country, etc. But when we study the tax revenue of our countries and we compare them with, for example, what was the tax revenue in terms of percentage of GDP when the European countries, the OECD countries, had the same GDP per capita that we have today. So we may make a fair comparison. We'll reach the conclusion that it's not an economic problem, but it's a political problem. Why? Because with the same GDP per capita, they had much higher tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. So my question to you, Jules, is basically, what is the conversation regarding tax revenue? In these 3 days, we haven't talked too much about that. Tax reform, structural tax reforms that would allow us to really increase the levels of expenditure to more reasonable levels, according, of course, to the capacity of each country. Yeah. But my point is, even today, we would have much more capacity than we're doing.
Yeah, but I wouldn't even take the issue from that angle at all. I take it from a completely different angle, and that is the question of wastage. Because let's put it this way, whether you're a millionaire or you're a pauper, the question is, what is your wastage? So for where we are, the example I gave there showed that, first of all, expenditure per GDP or in relation to GDP on education is higher in many of our islands than even some developed countries. So it's not a matter, the argument has always been framed, we need more money in education, but we're not looking at how much are we wasting in education, how much is being expended without achieving the results. And the reality is that you talk about taxation, some of our countries are already overtaxed. I know in my home country, for example, St. Lucia, pensioners pay tax. And from the time, their pensions are taxed. And from the time I was a PS, I used to be arguing with finance officials, when I'm working, I'm paying tax. I'm paying money into the NIS. When I retire, NIS pays me or government pays me a pension. I've already paid tax on what you're now trying to tax, right? So it's really a disadvantage to pensioners. And I mean, and then we talk about equity and, nobody left behind and so on. We have to ensure that every cent that we spend is optimally spent. And the answer to that is not more taxation. The answer to that is greater efficiency in the system and to ensure that every child goes through the system and succeeds, not the rhetoric of ministries. Because in Jamaica, not to cut you short, but in Jamaica, for example, I read just 2 days ago, what was it, Conception High School in Jamaica. They threw a child out of doing CAPE because they didn't get, was it? What? Immaculate. One of the high schools, the elite schools. They threw a child out, not allowing them to continue their CAPE studies because they didn't get the required grade that allows them to continue. Now think of all the money spent to bring that child to that level. And because they fall short on a grade, rather than look at how do you remediate them to reach a standard, you cut them short at that point. Really?
So I think we have been energized and activated by this conversation. And I know we will continue as we go forward, thinking not just about ideas, but moving towards actions and articulating the blueprint for those actions. So let's take an opportunity to thank Dr. Jules.